Buenas tardes. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you. A lot of you I've known for some time, some of you I've just met. I want to take an opportunity to single out a couple of people that I served with in the legislature. Jeff Wentworth was actually in the House. Actually, that's not true. When I first met Jeff, he was on the Board of Regents for the Texas State University system, which governs Salle State University in Alpine, Texas. And my service with him then in the legislature, Jeff worked tirelessly on things that I think are very important, like redistricting reform and some ethics stuff. And Jeff, it is really good to see you. The other person that I served with, I see my friend Rick Noriega, who I served with as well. Rick is famous in legislative history for two reasons. Number one, something that is really important to me on the national level, we have a conversation about dreamers and about these kids who went to college. The first legislation in the country which allowed the dreamers to have in-state tuition was passed in Texas and signed by Governor Perry. But the author of that bill is Rick Noriega. The other thing that I will tell you is that for legislators, the other piece of history, the other footnote, is that Frank Court and others joined in passing a constitutional amendment so that when a member of the legislature who was in the reserves was called up to active duty, their seat in the legislature wouldn't sit vacant, so that somebody would fill their seat. And so it was the first time in history, frankly, that someone had served in the Texas legislature in the House of Representatives without being directly elected, because Rick was activated. And he spent a year in Afghanistan, and his wife, Melissa, filled the seat in his stead. It was the first time that had ever happened in history. So what a couple, both service to Texas. And Rick, thank you as a veteran for your service. Thank you so much. Well, here's what I will tell you. If you're looking for, and I've said this before, if you're looking for this hardcore red meat kind of approach, you're looking in the wrong place. I think our country faces some phenomenal challenges, but the only way that we're ever going to climb over this hump is if we all work together and start thinking about ourselves as Americans. I have all of, 7 months now of seniority in the U.S. Congress. So you're going to get a 7-month perspective of the place. All right? And I will tell you that I was so excited about being, my mother, by the way, still thinks it was a miracle that I was elected. And so I was so excited to be there, to walk in the footsteps. You know, when you walk from my office to the Capitol and you walk through the basement of the Capitol and you realize that the rooms that you're walking by in the basement, it was a hospital during the Civil War. And you see all of these plaques for all of these people who are just phenomenal in U.S. history. And you really wander around, and you're in awe of the place, and you're wondering, wow, how did I get here? But then you get to know everybody, and you're wondering, how did they get here? It really is a microcosm. It really is, I guess, a microcosm of the country today. But one of the things that I hope that I bring to the table, that I try to bring to the table, is a very pragmatic approach. I'm from Alpine, a small town, in West Texas, where to be in my house, or to be in my office at 8 a.m. in the morning, I can leave my house at 7:59 and a half. And so the approach is not a very complicated. It's a very pragmatic approach. And the difficulty with Congress is that Congress doesn't take a pragmatic approach. In fact, it takes a very tortuous route to anything. And as a result, the needs of a lot of hardworking Americans and the goals are essentially ignored over a period of time. Our budget, it's more like what budget? The sequester? Wow, what a nightmare. Really, I mean, the original sequester policy as it was envisioned by Congress, imagine this. How many of you, raise your hand if you've ever heard of the U.S. Navy SEALs? They're a big deal. They're a big deal. Now, how many of you have ever listened to the U.S. Navy band? Do you realize that the U.S. Navy SEALs were being cut by the same percentage as the U.S. Navy band? That was the policy of sequestration. You'd cut the SEALs and the band by the same percentages because you were doing across-the-board cuts. Now, there's been some frittering and some changes along the way to make those kinds of things happen, but really, is that how you make a decision in your business? I will tell you that my family had a restaurant in Alpine, Texas from 1917 to 1997. And while I'm at that, let me say thank you, and then on the muchísimas gracias. Thank you let's thank the people who serve. Because as a guy who grew up waiting on tables, I really appreciate the work that you do. But my family had a restaurant from 1917 to 1997 for 80 years. And over that 80-year period, I don't remember ever being taught or shown about the business that you make across the board cuts. When you're doing your budget, or when you're paying your bills at the first of the month, the first thing you pay is a mortgage. And then you make your car payments. And then you make the other core payments that you have to make. And if there's any money left over at the end, that's what you do. You spend discretionary spending money. That's how it's done. And yet, that piece of common sense has never really made it to the congressional level. And that, I think, is a tremendous travesty for the rest of us. Now, I have to tell you, if I sound disrespectful to my colleagues, I don't intend to. Because I really do believe, I got to the legislature at a very young age. I was about 28, I guess, when I got elected. And for whatever reason, the speaker at that time was a guy named Gib Lewis. And Gib thought, perhaps, I guess he gambled, and he thought, maybe this guy has a little bit of talent. And so, in my first session as a member of the legislature, I found myself carrying, of all things, the school finance bill in a special session. And so my job was to go out and get 76 votes for a school finance bill. And in particular, it was the piece that allowed the state for the first time to help school districts build buildings. And so I went to this one member of the legislature, and I won't ever mention his name because Jeff would know who I was talking about. And so I went to him and he said, no, I'm not going with that. So I went back to the staff and I said, well, give me some more options. And so I had started off on plan A, and then I was on plan B, and then C and D, and pretty soon I'd gotten to plan Z, and I was getting ready to start over at double A. And I got a little impatient, and I walked into the speaker's office and I said, Mr. Speaker, why is he here? Why is he here? Because all he does is he says no. He never gives me any suggestions. He never gives me any constructive criticism. He never says anything that will help the process in any way. Why is he here? And Speaker Lewis, in his wise way, looked at me as this young 28-year-old kid and says, Pete, when I was running for speaker, I went to every member's district. And I went to his. He said, in fact, I did a Rotary or a Lions Club at lunch, and then afterwards he took me wandering up and down Main Street, and that evening was his Chamber of Commerce dinner, and I was the keynote speaker at the Chamber of Commerce dinner. And he said, so I met a lot of people in his district, and you know what? They're all just like him. So he said, he's representing his district really well. And so that is a lesson for me that I always treat the members of Congress with respect, because we all get there in the same way. We all get elected and represent constituencies, and we all have a job to do. But the frustration that I have is not really the election per se, it's what happens afterwards. Because one of the things that my parents taught me and instilled in me, and my 8-year-old is around somewhere, and so I wanted to listen, because one of the things that I try to instill in Nicolás, pues Nicolás, ¿estás poniendo atención? Wait. One of the things that I try to instill in Nicolás is this thing called manners. What happened to manners? What happened to being respectful of other people's views and being able to have a real conversation? Why is it that we all have to sit across the table and yell at each other and point fingers and blame each other for everything at the end of the day?
My first day as a newly elected, and not even sworn in yet, but as a member-elect of the United States Congress, I show up for orientation, and in my first day of orientation, there's these 2 lines where you can register, and you're gonna get an ID, and you're gonna get these kinds of things, and I show up, Madeleine and I show up for this orientation session. And she's in a line, and I'm in a line, and we're chatting as we walk up the line. Madeleine gets to her line first, and the lady looks up and smiles very sweetly and says, what's your name? My wife gives it. The lady looks down and with a very sweet smile, she looks back up and she says, I'm sorry, your name's not on my list. Now, Madeleine didn't say anything to me, but her face said it all. Because she looked at me and like, after 23 years of marriage, she didn't even give them my name. And so I, of course, am immediately going like, I realized I gave them your name. And so then the next question is, well, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Madeleine says, I'm a Democrat. So then the lady says very sweetly, you're in the wrong line. So there were separate lines for everything, for taking your pictures at a security camera. When you go to dinner and you're meeting the new members of Congress, you're kind of going and meeting the new members of Congress, except that all the Democrats have dinner in one room, and all the Republicans have dinner in another room. And the next day for lunch, all the Democrats have lunch in one room, and all the Republicans have lunch in another room. And that's inculcated from the very beginning. You want furniture? Because your chair breaks? You're a Democrat, you call this number. You're a Republican, you call that number. Now, I don't know if some of the furniture is red or blue, because I'm but that kind of stuff doesn't make any sense. The worst example, which I'm proud to say doesn't happen anymore, as of recently, is if you asked your member of Congress for a flag that flew over the U.S. Capitol, and you asked a Democrat to do that, the Democrat would call the Democratic flag flying office, and the Republican would call the Republican flag flying office. Because if you go out to the flagpole, you'd see that the Democrats and Republicans were taking turns flying the U.S. flag. Now, how dumb is that? When the U.S. flag becomes an object of partisanship. So, I will tell you that out of the 36 seats for the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives in Texas, this is the only seat that is competitive. In 20 years, remember we're 2-year terms, so do the math. In 20 years, this district has had 5 different colors. If you're looking at my election, I won this election by about 5 points. Ted Cruz carried the district, same people, same district, by 6 points. Okay? So people clearly do this, and then this. And you know what? I wouldn't have it anymore. You know what? Because that makes me talk to everybody. That makes me respond to everybody. That makes me work with everybody. And what exactly is a representative supposed to do if not represent everybody? So I think that as we go forward, there's a way forward. I'm still kind of optimistic. I haven't lost my optimism yet. There's an opportunity to do things that I think make a difference. But we've got to get to a point where you and I, not me as a congressman, but all of us as individual citizens, talk and correspond with and get to know our elected officials and talk to them about what's really important and how we need to put aside this judgment about Democrats and Republicans. Abraham Lincoln said, I vote with them when they're right, and I part company with them when they're wrong. And I think that's important for every elected official to do. Let's talk about a second on comprehensive immigration reform and what it means to Texas, because I talked a little bit about that when I talked about the Green Act. It's a big issue for me. This district is about 800 miles of U.S.-Mexico border. If you're looking at a map of Texas, this district is just under 24% of the entire state by land. If immigrants who are here unauthorized, just in Texas, We're given the opportunity to earn a path. Now, we're not talking about amnesty, because amnesty means that you forgive everything. I'm talking about a way that you earn citizenship. Total wages in Texas would increase by nearly $10 billion. And tax revenue in Texas would increase by $4.1 billion. And nearly 200,000 more jobs would be created. Wow. It's all about building up a business. It's all about having a labor. In the restaurant business, it's important to have a labor. In the home building business, it's important to have a labor. Right now, you go south up here to the Eagle Ford Shale Company, and it is a great opportunity for people. You know, I told you that I know more about the restaurant business than I care to, but if I wanted to open a restaurant business, there would be a lot of people eating lunch and breakfast and dinner in my restaurant in any of those counties in Eagle Ford Shale Country. There'd be a lot of people to eat, except there'd be one problem. What would that be? There wouldn't be any employees, because they're all in the oil fields. They're all working at gas. Those jobs pay a lot more. And so while this is in theory a great opportunity to make money, you can't open for lunch. You can't open for dinner. You can't have all of the shifts that you want. We need a labor pool. It's not rocket science. It's easy. And if you want to obstruct comprehensive immigration reform, you're actually obstructing economic growth, because we got to have people. In my part of the world, Presidio, Texas, they grow onions in Presidio, Texas. I will also tell you that when I took Madalena, my wife, walking door to door in Presidio, Texas, and I said, Madalena, this is my first campaign for state rep years ago. I said, Madalena, it's going to be really hot in Presidio. And my wife, who was raised in Laredo, says, heat. I'm from South Texas. I know heat. I can handle heat. It was 126 degrees in Presidio, Texas that day. And Madalena did a few doors, and then she said, you know what, the Catholic Church is open, I'll just wait for you in the Catholic Church. And so, how many American citizens are standing in line, waiting to pick onions in Presidio, Texas? How many American citizens are standing in line waiting to work cattle in West Texas, or pick agricultural products in South Texas, in the heat that we have? Well, it's not happening, and it has to happen, and it needs to happen. Well, the other thing, speaking of manners, that we need to watch is our rhetoric. There's a member of Congress who, as a person, I think is a nice guy. But there's a few members of Congress, actually, that, you know, when they say things, it just, you kind of have to wonder. One of my Texas colleagues who talked about, you know, we have to watch Mexico, because people are sending they're sending Middle Eastern people to Mexico to learn how to act Hispanic. And I wanted to ask him, so do I act Hispanic? What does it mean to act Hispanic? Steve King said that there were kids with calves the size of cantaloupes, and that was because they were mules carrying drugs back and forth. Well, I have to tell you that when you're talking about people, I mean, if you want to make comments about people who are not citizens, you have to remember that you're talking about, in my case, you're talking about my abuela. You know what an abuela is? I'm talking about my grandmother. And so the one thing that I was always taught as a little Mexican boy growing up on the south side of Upton, don't talk about my grandmother or my mom or my sisters or my wife. And if you're going to do that, do it with respect. Because we can have a conversation about the issues. We can have a conversation about whether we should have immigration reform, whether the budget is too big or too small, whether taxes are too high or too low or too dry. We can have all of those conversations. But why can't we have all those conversations like intellectually? Now, I will tell you, I had a conversation with a guy named Alan Simpson. was a U.S. Senator from Wyoming, and he said, it has always been that way. In fact, I left because it was around. And I said, really? It's always been that way? And he said, yeah. He said, it's gotten worse. He said, but now that you're a member of Congress, you ought to go over to the archives. And you ought to look at the original Bill of Rights and the drafts that they have, because they still have the original drafts of the Bill of Rights as it went through. And you can see that obviously there was one part that they had a big fight about. And I said, well, how do you know they had a big fight? And he said, because Thomas Jefferson wrote in the margin, oh, whatever. So maybe it's not so strange. But I think horrible, mindless policies like the sequester, I think bad public policy decisions like that, it's just incredible to me that 435 people, 535 if you educate them, they can't agree on much. And the only reason they can't agree on much is because we allow that as citizens. The state of this district is actually not too bad, but it would be even better if we participate. The state of our state is not too bad, but it would be even better if we participate. Just a few months ago, here in San Antonio, a city much bigger than Atlanta, over 1 million people, had contested races for mayor and for the city council. And at the end of the day, people were elected to the city council with just over 2,000 votes. Imagine that. You can be on the city council in a city this size with about 2,000 votes. I have that many cousins. We really, really have to do something about the rate of participation. My grandmother would tell me, no te puedes quejar si no quieres participar. You can't complain if you don't want to participate. So whether you're Republican or Democrat is of no consequence to me. The important thing is that we all work together for the benefit of our people. 8 years ago, my life changed in an absolutely incredible, phenomenal way that I could never have imagined. Because 8 years ago, I held this little 7-pound, you're gonna get there one day. I held this little 7-pound, 7-ounce kid in my hands for the very first time. And I cannot tell you, I understood at that moment that I would do anything I had to do to make sure that was what it was. That I would do anything I had to do to make sure that he has an opportunity, a future. Because that's all any of us want, is a better opportunity. When you think back to what your grandparents did for a living and what you're doing today, you'll see a huge, 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 huge progress. And we have to make sure that our kids and our grandkids can say the same things. Right now, you and I, we're part of the first generation of Texans and the first generation of Americans that's going to leave their country worse off than our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers left it to us. And we have to do something about that. So please join me. Democrats, Republicans, right wing, left wing, center wing, no wing. Please join me in participating in this democracy that we all call the United States of America. Join me in making not only San Antonio, but all of Texas and all of our country a much, much, much better. It's always been a land of opportunity. But let's make sure that it not only stays that way, but there's even more opportunity for our kids and our grandkids from here on out. Thank you so much for having me.
The Congressman has said that he will take some questions if anybody has any questions. There we go. There we go, right here.
Sure, let me repeat. What the question is essentially why is there a double standard? Why does Congress do one thing for Congress and then something else for everybody else? And I think you said the congressional increase is at 5% or so, cost of living or whatever. Here's this is 7 months of experience, so take it with a grain of salt. That I have seen so far, for example, there has been no congressional increases for either salaries or benefits. And the stuff that the congressional members have, I think right now you're going to see, for example, that I have employee insurance through the federal government. But effective January 1st, my employees and I will have to go to the exchange under the Affordable Care Act, like everybody else is having to do, so that my benefits are going to be the same as everybody else's. The cost of living kinds of things, from my perspective, what I've seen so far is that there is no, the sequester affected my office. My predecessor spent more money than I am spending on staff and offices and those kinds of things. Because of the sequester, I don't have that to spend. And I frankly think that that is okay. I think that it is important that you, I don't like the do as I say, but not as I do mentality. I believe that there has to be some consistency. And so Congress is passing laws that will apply right now to Congress, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or any others. And I actually think that that's a good thing. And frankly, I don't think it would have happened, but for what? What was I talking about a little while ago? What does it take? It takes public participation and public outcry. And when you have that, I think you have progress. And so that's why I think it's so important that people participate in the system and people make their views known. Now, I will also tell you that we also have to be very careful about what we, the small town boy in me remembers that on Friday nights, we had a lot of fun. And Saturday morning, there was all sorts of stories about the fun we had on Friday night. And sometimes, they were true. But many times, they were not. And in a small town in particular, you have to be able to divide the truth from the not truth. And one of the challenges in today's internet is people say all sorts of things, and you know, I know people who will tell me, well, I read it on the internet, it must be true. And the fact that you read it on the internet doesn't make it true. And so it's important that we stay informed about what's going on, and that if we have questions, that we actually call people and ask about the issues. Call your members of Congress and ask about it. I will tell you, for example, we talked at my table a little bit about the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline for me, I'm from West Texas, represented Pecos County, which is an oil and gas county, represented Ward County, which is an oil and gas county, represented Reeves County, which is an oil and gas county, Terrell, I mean, and how do you get your oil and gas from the wellhead to the refinery? Through pipelines. Pipelines a big deal to me? Do I think pipelines are a horrible thing? No, pipelines are fine if they're built right. So the Keystone Pipeline vote comes along, and I expect to be able to vote for the Keystone Pipeline. But the bill comes out, and the bill isn't we're going to build a pipeline from Canada through Oklahoma to Texas. The Texas part, by the way, is already permitted. It says we're going to allow Company X, a specific company, to build a pipeline. That's pretty unusual when you name a specific company in the law. But I could have lived with that. I mean, as a member of the legislature, it happens. It's rare, but it happens. The part that pushed me over the edge was the next part. Because the next part was, whether you're ConocoPhillips or you're ExxonMobil or you're Valero or whoever, you pay into this fund. And if something goes wrong, the best example is BP. Everybody remembers they had a little problem in the Gulf of Mexico not very long ago. Right? And who was responsible for cleaning up the Gulf of Mexico? BP is. Personal responsibility. Is there anything wrong with personal responsibility? I don't think so. I think everybody should be personally accountable for their actions. Every company should be accountable for its actions. The company that was building the pipeline, what section of the law did not apply to them? They were exempt from either paying into the fund or liability in case something went wrong. Could I vote for them? No. As a member of the legislature, I would have said, hey, you know what, I'm going to offer an amendment. I like your bill. I like 90% of your bill. There's this 10% that really bugs me. Can I fix the 10%? And the member of the legislature and me would have offered I love being a member of the I try to act like a member of the legislature, even though I'm a member of Congress, because I think members of the legislature have more sense. But anyway, that's another story. So I would have run up with an amendment. But in Washington, you can't offer an amendment unless the majority gives you permission. And so, was the majority going to give permission for this amendment? The answer was no. And I said, well, I want to vote for the bill. It's just this one part. I can't vote for it this way. And they said, all or nothing. You're in or you're out. And oh, by the way, Mr. Gallego, you're in a tough district. And if you vote no, there's the TV ad. You're anti-energy, you're anti-oil and gas, you're anti-jobs. And I said, well, you know what, when people tell me all or nothing, as a little boy growing up in Alpine, Texas, you know what I always said? If you give me that kind of choice and you threaten me that way, what do? I voted no, because I voted for responsibility. And you know what, after I talked to the energy industry, they were perfectly willing to be included in that bill. They didn't understand why that company was left out. Even that company didn't understand why they were left out. I didn't either. But I will tell you, as long as I'm around, I like consistency. You're not going to see any different. I'm not going to treat you any differently, and I'm not going to treat me any different. The trips that the congressional members take, you're not going to see me going to the Bahamas. You know where I went? I went to Afghanistan. And I came back with such incredible, tremendous respect for the men and women who serve in uniform. I had it before, but wow, I was at a place called Forward Operating Base Lightning, the front lines of where everything, all sorts of things happen. And it was amazing to me. And you know what was even more amazing? Talk about a small world. I met this kid, I call him a kid. I met this guy from San Antonio, and we had a great conversation. And about a month later, I'm having breakfast with a group of people, and this man says, his last name was Zendejas. It's a very, very, very unusual name. And so I'm sitting having breakfast, and the person next to me is Mr. Zendejas. And I said, you know what? I just recently met a Zendejas who's in the military. I met him on this overseas trip. And you should have seen the joy that he had. Because he said, that was my son. You talked to my son, how is he? And it was such a cool feeling. I'll tell you one more story about the military from me. If you ever walk outside of my office, there's a poster of every single person who was resident of District 23 who has died in the service of our country in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I have them there to remind me every single day of the importance of the sacrifice and the importance of the decisions that I made. And it was brought home to me because there was recently a high school class in my office, and this little girl comes up to me and she says, Mr. Gallego, why do you have that poster outside of your office? And I said, because I want to remember them, and I want everybody else to remember them too. I don't want anybody to forget. And she says, really? And I said, yeah, their families made a huge sacrifice for this country, and I don't want anybody to forget. And then she started crying. And she came up to me and she hugged me. And she said, Mr. Gallego, I didn't expect to come to Washington, D.C. and see a picture of my brother. And if you think that didn't hit home, even now, when I think about it, it's a big deal. So I will be consistent. I want our brothers and sisters and sons and daughters in the military to have a fair shake. I don't like the furloughs. I don't like the fact that people are losing their jobs. I don't like the fact that dumb decisions are being made. And I need your help to fix it. So thank you so much again for having me. I really enjoyed this opportunity. And Nicolas is looking at me like it's time to go back to Alpine. So